Before we delve into this gripping narrative, please share in the comments where you're tuning in from to experience this poignant tale. The snowstorm encounter. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to change someone's life. That's not to say I was a bad man. Far from it. I had everything most people dreamed of. Money, a penthouse in the heart of the city, a name that opened doors. But I was also alone, trapped in a world where success meant sacrificing the things that mattered. I had learned to keep my distance, to see people as numbers, transactions, or obstacles. Until that night. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. I had just finished a meeting with a group of investors and was heading home in my black Range Rover. The city was drowning in a blizzard, thick flakes of snow falling relentlessly, blanketing the roads in white. My driver, Michael, was careful as he maneuvered through the nearly deserted streets. The heater hummed, keeping the inside of the car warm, while outside, the world was frozen in an unforgiving chill. Then I saw her. At first, I thought she was just a pile of snow, a trick of the light. But as we got closer, I noticed a small figure lying crumpled on the sidewalk, barely visible under the layers of falling snow. A girl. She wasn't moving. I reacted before I could think. Michael, stop the car. He hesitated, glancing back at me through the rearview mirror. Sir, the roads are dangerous. Stop the car. My voice was sharper this time. Michael pulled over, and I stepped out into the biting cold. The wind cut through my expensive coat like a blade, but I didn't care. I rushed to the girl, kneeling beside her. She couldn't have been more than 20, maybe younger. Her face was pale, her lips nearly blue. Her dark hair was tangled with ice and snow, and she wore only a thin jacket, as if she had been caught in the storm with nowhere to go. My heart pounded. Hey, I said, shaking her shoulder gently. No response. Michael had stepped out now, his face tight with concern. She's not moving, sir. I reached for my phone and dialed 911. My fingers were numb, but I forced myself to speak clearly. I need an ambulance. Now. There's a girl, unconscious, on the corner of 5th and Pine. She's freezing. The dispatcher asked me to check for a pulse. I did, faint but there. She was alive, but barely. They're on their way, I said, gripping my phone tightly. Michael removed his coat and placed it over her, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't just stand there, waiting while she lay dying in the snow. Screw this. I didn't think twice before lifting her into my arms. She was impossibly light, barely more than a shadow. We're taking her in the car. Sir, are you sure? Michael, now. We moved quickly, placing her in the back seat. I turned up the heat, letting the warmth of the car envelope her frozen form. Her breathing was shallow, but at least she was breathing. I found myself staring at her, wondering who she was. Why was she out here alone in the middle of a snowstorm? Where had she come from? Minutes later, flashing lights painted the snow in streaks of red and blue. The paramedics arrived, moving fast, checking her vitals, lifting her onto a stretcher. Hypothermia, one of them said grimly. If you hadn't found her. The words hung in the air, unfinished but clear. She would have died. I watched as they loaded her into the ambulance, my heart still hammering. I had no idea why, but I couldn't just walk away. Where are you taking her? I asked. St. Joseph's Hospital, a paramedic replied. I nodded. I'll follow. Michael gave me a questioning look but said nothing. I wasn't sure what had come over me either. I had seen people in need before, people begging on the streets, shivering in the cold, but I had never stopped. Not until now. Something about this girl, something about tonight, felt different, and I wasn't ready to let it go. The silent battle. Have you ever watched someone fight for their life without even knowing they were fighting? It's a strange thing, to see a body so still, yet knowing a war is raging inside. That's what I witnessed as I stood in the corner of the hospital room, hands in my coat pockets, watching the unconscious girl battle against the cold that had nearly stolen her life. After the paramedics had rushed her into the ER, I had every intention of leaving. I told myself that I had done my part, called 911, gotten her help, and made sure she was in good hands. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. Instead of walking away, I found myself in the waiting area, pacing, ignoring my phone as it buzzed with missed calls from colleagues and messages about meetings. I had built my life on efficiency, on making the most logical choices. But none of this was logical. Nothing about me being here, waiting for an update on a complete stranger, made sense. And yet here I was. It took the doctor's hours to stabilize her. I had bribed, threatened, and pulled every string I had to get information on her condition. Normally, hospitals wouldn't give out details to a random bystander, but being a man with influence had its perks. Eventually, a tired-looking doctor had emerged from the ER, rubbing his eyes before giving me the news. She's stable, but it was close. Hypothermia took a serious toll on her body. Her organs were slowing down, her body temperature was dangerously low, and if she had been out there even 10 minutes longer, she wouldn't have made it. He shook his head. She's lucky you found her. Lucky. The word stuck with me. Was it luck, or was it something else? Now, standing in her room, I studied her properly for the first time. She looked so young, maybe early 20s. Her skin was pale, her lips no longer blue but still too colorless. An IV dripped fluid into her veins, and a heart monitor beeped steadily beside her bed. She was still unconscious, wrapped in thick blankets, her breathing soft but steady. Who was she? And why was she out there alone? I had seen too much in my life to believe in coincidences. People didn't just end up half frozen on the street for no reason. Either she had been running from something or had nowhere to go. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I had told myself that once I saw she was okay, I'd leave. That was the plan. But as I turned to go, I heard it. A sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A whisper. Please. I froze. My head snapped back to her, but her eyes were still closed. Her face was tight, eyebrows drawn together as if she were in pain. She mumbled something else, too soft for me to hear. I stepped closer. Don't. Leave. It was barely a breath, but it was enough to shake me. Something deep inside me clenched. I had no idea who she was, what she had been through, or why she was whispering in her sleep, like she was afraid of being abandoned. But at that moment, none of that mattered. I wasn't going anywhere. So, instead of walking out that door, I pulled up the chair beside her bed and sat down. And I waited. The first glimpse of truth. People say time moves slowly in hospitals. I never really understood what they meant until I sat in that room, watching a girl I didn't know fight her way back to life. I wasn't a man who spent much time waiting. My entire life had been built on control. Controlling outcomes, controlling people, controlling risks. But in that moment, I had no control at all. I could only sit there, listening to the soft beeping of the heart monitor, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the occasional sound of nurses shuffling past the door. The hours stretched. Morning came and went. And then, finally, she stirred. It was subtle at first, a slight twitch of her fingers, a faint furrow of her brow. But then, with a sharp inhale, her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes, deep brown, filled with confusion, darted around the room before settling on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I watched as her expression shifted from confusion to panic. She tried to sit up too quickly, only to wince as pain shot through her. Easy, I said, leaning forward. You need to take it slow. Her breathing was uneven, her gaze still wild. She glanced at the IV in her arm, then at the hospital gown she was wearing. Where am I? Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. St. Joseph's Hospital, I answered. You were found outside. In the snow. You almost didn't make it. I saw the exact moment my words registered. Her lips parted slightly, and something unreadable flickered across her face. Snow, she repeated, as if testing the word. Then she swallowed. I don't remember. I frowned. You don't remember being out there? She shook her head weakly. No. I don't even know how I got here. Her fingers clutched at the blanket, her knuckles white. The fear in her eyes was raw. Do you remember anything? I pressed. Your name. Where you live. She hesitated. Then, almost shamefully, she whispered, no. A beat of silence stretched between us. She was lying. I could see it in the way her gaze flickered away from mine, the way her shoulders tensed. She wasn't just confused, she was hiding something. I exhaled, running a hand down my face. Look, you don't have to tell me anything. But the doctor said you were out there for a long time. If no one reports you missing, the hospital will eventually send social workers to figure out where you belong. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she stared at the IV in her arm, her jaw tightening. I sighed. If you have nowhere to go, I can help. That made her snap her head toward me. Why? The question hit me harder than it should have. Why? I didn't have a good answer. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe because I was the one who found you. Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone. Her eyes softened slightly at that. She looked away, her fingers tightening on the blanket again. I don't want charity. I smirked. Good, because I don't believe in charity. That made her blink, confused. What I believe in, I continued, is helping people who actually want help. So, if you don't want it, say the word, and I'll walk out that door right now. Her lips parted, as if she were about to tell me to leave. But then something shifted in her expression, a flicker of hesitation, a moment of vulnerability, and finally, a whisper. I don't know what to do. It wasn't an acceptance, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a start. And for some reason, I felt like I had just taken the first step into something much bigger than either of us. A fragile trust. The hardest thing about helping someone isn't offering them a warm bed, food, or even a second chance. It's getting them to believe they deserve it. I learned that fast. After she whispered those hesitant words, I don't know what to do. The air in the hospital room felt heavier, as if we had both stepped onto a fragile bridge, unsure if it would hold. She still hadn't told me her name. She still hadn't admitted what had happened to her, but I could see it, the war in her eyes. She wanted to trust me, but something inside her wouldn't let her. I leaned back in the chair, watching her fingers absently pick at the edge of the blanket. The hospital won't keep you forever, I said. Sooner or later, someone will want answers. If you don't give them, they'll make decisions for you. She exhaled shakily. Like what? They'll involve social services, maybe the police. If they think you're in danger, they might send you to a shelter or a program. Her jaw tightened. I don't need a shelter. I raised an eyebrow. Then what do you need? She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than words ever could. I wasn't a fool. I knew the signs of someone who had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I had seen it in people before, people who had fallen through the cracks, who had learned to survive alone because they had no other choice. I had been one of them once. I have a place, she muttered. I tilted my head. Then why were you out in a snowstorm, half frozen to death? Silence. She wasn't going to answer. Fine. I wasn't the kind of man who pushed where I wasn't wanted, but I wasn't about to leave her to wander back into the cold either. I have an extra place, I said casually, as if the idea hadn't been sitting heavy in my mind since the moment I found her. A spare apartment. No strings. No questions. Just a place to rest until you figure things out. Her head snapped toward me. Why would you do that? The disbelief in her voice stung more than I expected. Because I can, I said simply. And because I don't like the idea of you ending up back on the street. Her fingers curled into the blanket, as if she were bracing for something. And if I say no? I met her gaze evenly. Then I walk out that door, and we pretend this conversation never happened. I could see her mind racing, calculating. Whatever had happened to her, it had taught her to be wary, to expect hidden motives. Finally, she licked her lips, her voice barely above a whisper. "For how long?" I exhaled, feeling the smallest hint of victory. "As long as you need." Her hands trembled slightly. Whether from the cold or fear, I wasn't sure. She swallowed hard. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay." It was just one word. But I knew, for her, it meant everything. And for the first time, I realized, so did it for me. A new beginning. If someone had told me a week ago that I'd be sitting across from a girl I found half frozen in the snow, watching her cautiously take a bite of toast in my penthouse, I would have laughed them out of the room. But here we were. She still hadn't told me her name. Not her real one. Anyway. "Call me Emma," she had said quietly when I had driven her to my spare apartment. Emma. I knew it wasn't her real name. But I didn't push. She had stood at the doorway of the apartment, looking around with wary eyes, as if she expected the walls to vanish any second. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a clean, modern space, simple furniture, and warmth. Probably the first warmth she had felt in a long time. She had stepped inside slowly, her fingers brushing against the back of the couch, the edge of the counter. Testing reality. Testing if this was real. She wasn't used to safety. That thought hit me harder than I expected. She had spent the first day barely speaking. She had eaten in small, careful bites, as if she wasn't sure when her next meal would come. She had jumped slightly whenever I moved too quickly or spoke too loud. She was used to surviving, not living. And so, I gave her space. I kept my distance, checking in without hovering, offering small comforts without expecting anything in return. I wasn't here to fix her. I just wanted her to have a choice. And then, on the third night, something changed. I had dropped off some groceries at the apartment and was about to leave when I heard her voice behind me. "You're not like other rich guys." I turned. She was standing there, arms crossed, watching me with something different in her eyes. Not fear, not wariness. Curiosity. I smirked. What are other rich guys like? They don't stop for people like me. I leaned against the counter, considering her words. Maybe they don't, but I'm not them. She studied me for a long moment, as if trying to decide something. Then, finally, she spoke again. "I ran away," she admitted quietly. I didn't move. She took a deep breath. From someone who hurt me. From a life I didn't want. I had nowhere to go. I thought I could make it on my own, but the world doesn't work that way. Her voice was steady, but I saw the way her fingers trembled slightly at her sides. She wasn't just telling me a fact. She was handing me a piece of herself. I met her gaze. "You don't have to tell me everything. But if you ever do, I'll listen." A long silence stretched between us. Then, slowly, she nodded. And that was it. No dramatic moment. No life-changing confession. Just trust, fragile but real. A beginning. As I left the apartment that night, I realized something strange. I had meant to save her. But maybe, just maybe, she had saved me too.